morning. So I really want to, I know sometimes they thank people at the end. I want to start off by thanking some very important people at Cambria Press because they've been amazing. I wanted to thank Director Ms. Tawny Tan for that very kind introduction. I wanted to thank the head editor, David Armstrong, and especially the editor of the Studies in Slavery Past and Present series, Ana Lucia Araujo. It's truly because of Ana that I was attracted to collaborate with Cambria in the first place. I remain really inspired by her work and know that my publication is in good company in the Studies in Slavery series. I should also note that in today's world of publishing, it is increasingly rare to find a press that will support the inclusion of a fair number, and I'm talking more than 2, more than 3, maybe tops 4, a fair number of color images. And this book that I've passed around in the audience contains 18 color images, and for that I am eternally grateful to Cambria. That's really an achievement. I thought I would start off today by sharing how I became interested in the topic of my book. That's usually something people want to know. I have been conducting research on modern and contemporary Afro-Brazilian art for over 15 years now. And it was during one of my many, many trips to Brazil that I first encountered the figure of the Black wet nurse. So in 2005, I was in São Paulo with the artist Rosana Paulino, and she was showing me a couple of images of sculptures that she had done of this subject. And she was talking to me and explaining to me what the works were about and this history of how white families, elite white families in Brazil used enslaved Black women to breastfeed their babies. And I just immediately was fascinated by this. And I was pressing her for more information, and so we were discussing it, and at some point she sort of said, Kimberly, you know that they also did this in the United States, you know, they also had this practice too. And I thought, apparently wet nursing wasn't a topic that they covered in my middle and high school history classes growing up in upstate New York when we talked about slavery. So I had a lot of learning to do. And I was immediately intrigued to educate myself more about this practice. It was as if as soon as I became attuned to the history of wet nursing in Brazil and started to do even a little bit of investigating, that I came across a variety of artistic renderings of the Black wet nurse, which just made me want to find out more. So each representation only further fueled my desire to explore who these women were, right, and what they represented, both, that is, at the time that the artworks were made, but also today. So for example, I'm thinking about in the early 19th century when we have the first visual representations, you know, who was creating these representations and who was going to be their audience? And both the artists as well as the audience, really what was their understanding of what these women were doing, what they were being forced to do, and you know, just what was the situation at that time, and really trying to figure out, do those historical representations tell us anything about individual experiences, or are they supposed to just represent a quote-unquote type of woman? And then when you look at the images today, you know, who sees them now, and where we see them, how does that affect, again, contemporary audiences' understanding of slavery and all of the different roles that women played as enslaved women? And also, I was very intrigued as to how do modern and contemporary scholars use these images as illustrations in their book. A lot of the time they're nice visuals, but they don't actually analyze the image, or sometimes they do, but they simply repeat information that they've found someplace else, which I have, you know, arguably found to not necessarily be correct. So that's really how this project began, was through that conversation with the artist Rosana Paulino. Now I thought I would just share a few of the points that resonated with me the most from conducting my research for the publication. The first is white male control. Although it may seem obvious that white male slave owners had control over enslaved Black women's breast milk when they forced them to serve as wet nurses for their own families, for other white families, and sometimes institutions that took in abandoned children. Also very often forcing those women to give up their own children. Okay? Most people don't stop to think about the role of white male control in terms of the art. So both European and subsequently Brazilian men captured the Black wet nurse in their artistic renderings and thereby controlled when and how the Black wet nurse was represented in prints, in photographs, in paintings, and in sculptures from the first half of the 19th century onward. And it was only in 2005 that those aforementioned works by the artist Rosana Paulino offered a counterpoint to that one-sided history of artistic representation by white males. So although we're talking about a practice that originated during the era of slavery, we don't see a Black female artist representing those Black wet nurses until the 21st century. So those visual renderings, hi, come on in. So this visual rendering shed light not only on Brazilian history, but on Brazilian art history. So in contrast to that white male dominance, equally enlightening for me to learn about was the ways that Black society challenged that hegemony. So for example, approximately halfway through the 19th century, some free Black women began to sell their breastfeeding services, thereby defying the traditional power dynamic and system by vending their own breast milk. They placed announcements in newspapers advertising their services alongside slave owners who were advertising the services of Black females. And then post-abolition, acting as a wet nurse gave some Black women a way to earn a living to support their families. Of course, at that time, they kept their children, but maybe that was one of the ways that they could support their families. Approximately in the mid-20th century, it was Blacks in São Paulo who revived a movement, first spearheaded by whites in Rio de Janeiro, calling for a public work of art to honor the Black wet nurse. And it's due to their efforts that the monument to the Black wet nurse, or the ama-de-leite in São Paulo, exists today. Most importantly, for me personally, probably, however, is the idea of the Black wet nurse as an unlikely national hero of sorts. So if one considers the various artistic renderings from the 19th century onward, one sees how over time this marginalized quote-unquote type associated with the era of slavery becomes an unparalleled symbol of social, cultural, and political change. She's an important figure not only in Black history, but in national history as a unique reflection of changing attitudes toward race. When we look at the role of famous or well-recognized Black women from the era of slavery, say in the United States, right? There is no Brazilian parallel to Sojourner Truth or say Harriet Tubman, right? These women that you can reference them by name. There is no one single famous Black wet nurse in Brazil. One cannot point to her image and call her by name as they can with a monument of the 17th century resistance warrior Zumbi in Rio de Janeiro, or say, for example, the bust of the 19th century abolitionist poet Luiz Gama in São Paulo. Nevertheless, scores of anonymous Black women breastfed generations of Brazilian infants, thereby nourishing a nation, to reference the title of my book. So it's with this publication that I hope to call attention to the Black wet nurse in Brazil, to her story, to her sacrifice, and ultimately recognize her as a national hero.